several. So it's kind of small-ish, if you will. I'm not sure why it's not blowing up into full screen or anything.
Well, mine's full screen.
I've had that
I'm
at
not sure
home,
what's going on.
where I could make adjustments and zoom into what you're doing. I had to play with it to figure it out. Skype updated some things recently.
Chris says Skype updated some things and made some changes.
Okay.
I was
Well,
able to make it get, to focus on the text and blow it up and minimize the others with one of the sidebars or something.
okay, well, I don't want to hold things up.
All right. We're going to start with 1 Corinthians 7:16. We've got all these up on the internet, all the classes, and appreciate the ones that are doing it, and they come on the side here. Paul in Virginia, Moisant, and they're very helpful to us. We appreciate them and their work. All right, 1 Corinthians 7:16. I want to pick on Jerry first. Jerry, could you read that for us and then translate it?
Yes. T gar odas gunay a ton andra soseis a t wedas oner a tain gunaika soseis. For what do you know, O wife, whether the husband you shall save? Or what do you know, O husband, whether the wife you shall save?
Okay. Or what knowest thou? What do you know? What do you know? Whether you might save your wife or your husband. And your wives might save your husband. Now, can you think of another passage that tells a wife how to save her unbelieving husband, or how she might be instrumental in that?
That was Peter, I believe, that without words, but by the behavior.
Yeah,
By her behavior.
That's in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And so how she lives can become a way of attracting his attention to Christianity. He says, man, I've got such a wonderful wife. I wonder why she's so good. And it might just help win him over. Okay. The question becomes,
Maybe after she dies, but
yeah, I knew a man that he was a Christian.
Sister Overturks.
And she didn't obey the gospel until after he died. And I thought, oh, such a terrible shame, because he sure wanted her to obey.
Sister Overturk's husband didn't obey until after she died.
Yeah. Well, it's good that he did obey, though. Okay, finally. Okay.
She won him over.
Yeah.
She just didn't know.
She's just a good woman. Right. So now Gar is going to do what?
Explain what the previous verse was about.
Yeah, it reaches back to the previous verse, and I think it's giving one reason for continuing in the marriage. I think we had this problem in it. Whenever two of the three of you are in the logic class, we're going to see that one point of logic, there are four forms of, we can make statements that are true or false. When we get to it, we'll see whenever he makes one statement to prove something, he has to be denying something else. If he denies something, he's denying something that someone claimed to be true. And we can actually reproduce what they're denying by this procedure. We'll be able to see. And this will help us to see we'll see answers to some of these questions of what he's talking about. And this will help us in our study of the Bible. So in that logic class. And of course, it's being recorded, and Paul and Virginia are putting it on the internet for us, and they're doing a good job, okay? Right? So we'll weave that into the logic class. That'll be very helpful. But right here, and so with the word gar, he reaches back to that. And I think 1 Corinthians 7:16, part of its context has to be 1 Peter 3:1-6 that we just talked about. How do you know? And that's perfect tense. How do you know? And oida is perfect tense. And so oidos is a second person singular perfect, indicative active. So you knew it and you have come to know it and still know it. And he addresses the wife, whether you shall save, and of course that's future tense, your husband, right? And I think it's possible the wife might be able to teach her children the gospel as well. Although that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the husband. But, stay in the marriage and you might be able to salvage it, might salvage his soul, might be instrumental in converting him. And 2 Timothy 1:5, we see a mother and grandmother. Apparently his father was a Greek, or Timothy's father was a Greek, and he just apparently his father wasn't never to obey God or become probably a Jew, and probably didn't convert to Judaism. Okay,
Not told that he did anyway.
he might have been a proselyte of the gate, though. All right, that's possible. We just don't know. Okay, or he might have died. He could have easily died too. Any questions? All right. James, you were asking something or saying something there. What was it?
No, sir, I'm good.
Okay. Peter gives instructions, of course, as I noted, 1 Peter 3:1-6. I think that's important. And if you want, I've got notes on that. Okay. Or how knowest thou, O husband? So now he turns to the husband. So now he's addressing both the man and the woman here. So we know the first part was addressed to the wife, and now he's addressing the husband. In the same vein, he's saying, stay in the marriage. Don't just get out because your mate's not a Christian. And so if a person obeys the gospel, that's no reason to get out of your marriage to a non-Christian spouse, right?
From these verses, it appears that it was one-sided. It was the wives were being converted, women were being converted, and then somebody was convincing them to get out of the marriage, that it would be sinful to stay in a marriage. But he also then turns it around, so it works both ways. But he really focuses on the wife doing that to the husband.
Well, my experience is, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's just me, but I think there's a lot more women that tend to want to obey the gospel. For some reason, women seem to do. There's just a lot of men that don't want to know. It's not manly to be a Christian.
Yeah, women don't have the ego issues as much.
And there may be more women that have it than men. I can't say that there will be, but I'm not sure about that. But it does. It appears that way. Any questions or
It also
comments?
points out clearly that God does not consider it a sin for a Christian to be married to a non-Christian, especially in the case of becoming a Christian after you've already married,
There's some that claim it's a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. I don't believe it is. I think it's foolish to marry a non-Christian. But we get into 2 Corinthians 6 where they get that passage. So I think I would like to go into 2 Corinthians since we finish 1 Corinthians. And we'll see what y'all want. Okay. Any question? I translated it for, how do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband, or the Greek is the husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you shall save your wife, or the wife? That's pretty low.
That's almost like making it personal to a woman. The makes it more universal
Yeah.
a little bit. That's
Now, he now is going to give some generic principles that are drawn from marital relationships. He's going to apply them to other relationships, okay? All right? So Chris, could you read verse 17 and then translate it for us?
Yes. Eme, eketos, ekestos, ekasto, hos, em, isan, ho, theos, hexaton, hos, kekle, kin, ho, kurios, otus, peri, pate, ito, kai, utos, entais, ecclesias, passes, dia tasomai. So I have, but as God has allotted to each, as the Lord has called, in this manner let him walk, and in this manner I direct in all the churches.
Okay? Amen is pretty emphatic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's pretty emphatic. And as God has distributed, the American Standard reads, how did you translate?
I have allotted or divided or assigned. There's
Okay.
three choices.
He's partitioned it off into parts and cut it into parts and pieces. So each person has been given a certain role. I think we have certain skills and abilities, and God expects us to use them to his glory. Some men are good speakers and some are not. Some are good song leaders, some are not. And you know, we all have roles in which we can function, and we may have, by our education or by our role we have in the world. We have one man in the congregation here, or actually two men that have worked in heating and ventilation, air conditioning systems. So I just say, fellas, tell me what you think we ought to do. And so I lean on them pretty heavily. And of course, Jerry's done it too, but he knows the two I'm talking about. But, so they're pretty good at it, so they kind of know. And so there are roles that we can all perform. And so each man has his own role. And this word is marizo, is found in Romans 12:3 and 2 Corinthians 10:13. These passages translated hath dealt in the American Standard in a portion, a measure. In 2 Corinthians 10:13, it's on the screen up there. We might view that this is each person, almost like being given talents. God gives talents by means, I think, of his providence. We might view this as God giving options for each of us, and we choose the better part, like we see in Luke 10:42, Martha and Mary. And so we make choices. I grew up on a farm, and a lot of the stuff that I saw on the farm, I can see things in the Bible with an agrarian background, and I can understand some of the things that are in there better than a city kid. And so what I'm teaching, I try to explain it to people, because I worked in the fields, and you know, I know what those are. Okay. Any questions? I'm proud with a team of horses and so forth. So, but we can all learn that we have different backgrounds. And so some people are good teachers, some are good song leaders, some are good at just meeting people and reading, some are real good at visiting people that are sick, going to them and encouraging them. We all have our talents. Okay? So only as Lord of distributes man as God hath called thee, so let him walk, and so ordain out all the churches. So this is instruction, not just at Corinth, but everywhere in all the churches. Walking is peripateo, and let him walk. And of course, that's,
I put continue to walk, isn't it?
yeah,
And that's because isn't that
because it's present
present
imperative.
tense, present imperative?
It's present imperative. So continue to walk. Now, peripateo,
Actually, I put continue to live.
pateo is to walk. Peri is around. And so peripateo became a figure for how you lived. And they put, and the scholars claimed it might have been picked up from the Hebrew influence of the Septuagint and the Hebrew Old Testament as well. So it's a way, it's how you live and your manner of living. I think Christianity is your walk of life, how we live. I used to hear this when I was younger. Don't hear it much anymore. What's your walk of life? What do you do? And they call that what do you walk? That's your occupation. They use that for your occupation or how you live. And so it's used in the Bible that way, however. So it's how you live. He calls, so let us walk, so let us live. And be our walk of life. And I ordain, and that's middle passive form of the tasso. Now I'm going to take it on the screen up here. We have the and tasso, two words. They're compounded. Tasso is I arrange or I place or arrange something. The is through. So it's pretty emphatic. And it's appoint or ordain or arrange or set in order, right? In all the churches. So this is for the whole church. All the epistles, Paul taught the same thing in all the churches, 1 Corinthians 4:17. We've already seen that. So he's telling us again that I want this in all the churches, not just the Corinthian church. So this tells me right here by implication that the Corinthian epistle was intended for all the churches. It tells us that he intended for it to be used. And there's some people say, well, how do you know this was for us? Well, this tells me right here it's for us. And Paul taught the same thing everywhere. So the Galatian epistle, what he taught them, that's for all the churches too. 1 Corinthians 4:17, that's on the top of the screen right now. Okay. Even as I teach everywhere in every church, so I teach the same things in all the churches. Now, here's my argument. If Paul taught the same thing in every church, then what Paul taught in Galatia was taught in Ephesus, Rome, Corinth, Philippi, and so forth. He taught the same thing in every church, so he taught the same thing everywhere. He ordained this in all the churches. What he ordained here was ordained in all the churches. So the same argument to be made right here for what he ordained. And just giving instructions to stop divorcing their unbelieving mates, continues by telling them to continue in whatever state they find themselves. So he's going to talk about finding yourself in a particular state. However, let me point out, he is talking about lawful states, not unlawful states, not sinful states. If you've been a crook, you've been a thief, and a robber, you need to quit being a thief or a robber, okay? So this is not allowing people to continue in some sinful state. Go back to 1 Corinthians 6:9-11, and they quit doing those things, and he listed the things. They quit being homosexuals, 1 Corinthians 6. And so they gave that up. If a man was in a homosexual marriage and he obeyed the gospel, he needs to do what? Get out of that marriage. Homosexual, which God doesn't recognize anyhow. But he needs to get out of it. And he can get out of it and become a Christian and live as a Christian and do that, okay?
But they might use this verse and ignore those other verses
Yeah.
to say, this is how I came in, so this is how I remain.
Yeah, that's exactly what some do. That's why I brought this up.
Yeah.
I've heard it. Right? Only as God has distributed each man, as the Lord has called each, so let him walk. The presumption is, if you go back to 1 Corinthians 6, that he quit walking in sinful ways, so this is only things that are lawful to begin with. And in this context, it was a lawful marriage. It wouldn't justify homosexual marriage, for example. And I ordain this in all the churches. So the presumption is that it's lawful to begin with. That would, otherwise, it's saying you can keep on sinning whatever you've been doing. Okay. Now we have to repent to become a Christian. Okay. He's going to list a bunch of things where you need to continue in that state and not worry about it. All right. The next verse, verse 18. James, can you translate that for us, please?
Yes, sir. Peri tet memenos tis eklephe me epispatho en acrobustia tis eklephe me peritemnesto. And I translated that verse 18 as, was anyone called that was circumcised? Do not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised.
See, so is there anything sinful about being circumcised?
No.
Is there anything sinful about being uncircumcised? No. So he's not talking about sinful relationships. He's going to give some relationships here that are lawful. So if you're circumcised, don't worry about it. Just don't. And if you're uncircumcised, don't worry about trying to get circumcised. All right. And so any man, this is an indefinite, a certain one. You were called. Now we're called by the gospel. We've already seen that in our other study of Thessalonian epistles. And chapter 2, verse 14 of 1 Thessalonians, I think it was. So we're called by the gospel, and you're called by the gospel, and if you're circumcised, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter whether you are or aren't. That's the point. This is a lawful situation. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile is irrelevant now. It's not important. It was important before the cross. If you're going to serve God, I believe the non-Jews had a way to serve God under the patriarchal law. But if they wanted to become a Jew, they had to be circumcised, and they could become a proselyte. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile is no longer important, Galatians 3:26 through 29. Any question?
I added the word choose to become uncircumcised or choose to become circumcised because they're middle voice. And there were people putting pressure on them to choose those things, to become circumcised if you were in a Jewish dominant area, or to become uncircumcised if you were in a maybe the Roman type of Greek area where it wasn't predominantly Jews.
Well, this is middle passive form. I agree with you. I think it is middle voice. That's my interpretation. But of course, it is an interpretation. But I agree that.
So I should put those in.
It's middle passive form. The third, become uncircumcised is. But I think it's middle. Okay. Although they might have been submitting to someone encouraged them to be circumcised.
It's still a choice, though.
Yeah, you still have to choose to do it. There were some people, and this is on the screen up here. This is Thayer. The rabbins, that's the rabbis, wrote about it during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, when the Jews, there was a record in some of the writings of Maccabean books of a Jewish woman who had her baby was circumcised, and the Greeks, under Antiochus Epiphanes, they took the baby and killed it, and they hung it around her neck and made her have that dead baby around her neck because he'd been circumcised. They killed the baby, and she was a Jewish woman, and that would be ultimate. They went through a lot. The Jews did, and so that just makes tears come to my eyes what they did to that woman. I hope she stayed faithful to God and will be in heaven. That's what I hope. I hope she didn't let them drive her away. But apparently that's what the book claimed that that's what happened. Okay, and so the Jews apparently were trying to find some procedure to make it look like they weren't circumcised anymore because they were afraid they'd be killed. And that's what Bayer talks about on page 243. Okay. Any questions? Become uncircumcised. And that definitely would be the metaphor. You're doing it to yourself, right? I think it's might be a synecdoche to one who wanted to end all Jewish relationships. It might just be referring to wanting to just do away with all the Jewish background, and there's nothing wrong with observing some of your Jewish customs. If a Jew wanted to rest on the Sabbath day, he could. And it might be, if he did do this and continued to observe it, he might have more influence on trying to convert some of his fellow Jews. If he rejected it, which would be wrong for him to take the Sabbath and not work. And if he lived in Palestine, he might get in trouble, might get stoned if he did work on the Sabbath day. Okay, so he might need to take it off, and because he could actually be killed and it wouldn't be wrong for him to rest on the Sabbath day. There wouldn't be anything wrong with it.
Or let his animals rest, or his servants rest because they needed to.
Yep. So he could do it. Wouldn't be wrong. He could observe the Sabbath. He could eat kosher food too. Wouldn't be wrong. And it might be that doing that would actually help him to convert some of his Jewish friends to become Christians. So sometimes we can just give up that liberty like we talked about last week. Okay. Any questions? Hath any been called in uncircumcision? The word circumcision, uncircumcision is found mostly in the New Testament in about 3 books. Now, 3 or 4 books. That would be Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. Most of the time, that's where it's found. The bulk of it's found in Romans, okay? Book of Romans. Uncircumcision was the mark that you're a Gentile. Circumcision was the mark that you're a Jew. So he might be just using those as synecdoche for trying to get rid of all your Jewish background, trying to get rid of all Jewish customs. But observing the customs, as I pointed out, could be a factor in helping convert some of your Jewish friends. And you may have to observe them or be stoned if you try to work on the Sabbath, for example, in Palestine. Right? So let him not be circumcised.
He's been talking about marriage, but I think he threw this in because that's an example of how you've been called. And it's always been a problem for Paul where he went. So I think he's sneaking one in on him that may not have been the question they actually asked.
I translated it this way because it's made with the present imperative. Was any called being circumcised, let him stop seeking to have himself uncircumcised. That's how I translated it. Has any been called in uncircumcision, let him stop seeking to have himself circumcised. Right? So there's no need in a Gentile. Circumcision is not going to help him a bit in converting Jews. Right? He'd have to become a proselyte to them and positively influence them. Okay. So the Jews need to be influenced by fellow Jews. Because the Gentile, what they say is not going to matter much to a Jew. Okay. And knew the Old Testament scriptures could maybe convert them. Okay. Any questions? All right. He goes on in verse 19. Jerry, can you take that for us?
Hey, Harry, Tomei. I'm unfocused here just a moment. There it is. Udain, Estan, Kai, Hey, Akro, Bustia, Udain, Estan, Ala, Te, Races, Eto, Lone, Theu. The circumcision is nothing, and the uncircumcision is nothing, but, and I added instead, keeping God's commandments.
Okay. Everyone, I assume you know what ellipsis is. Okay. Ellipsis is where a word is stated and the whole sentence is not spoken or written. And it's, you have to fill it in and what he said. And I have illustrated this with my son when he was about 12 years old. We had the truck coming to pick up the trash. And he was supposed to take the trash bin out to the street. He was about 12 or 13 years old. And so he said, Dad, I'll do it. And so I could hear the truck coming. And I had to ask him a couple of times, and I looked at him and said, go. Just G-O. And he took off and but go became a whole sentence. And he understood, you go take the trash. So that was one two-letter word became a whole sentence. I've used that to illustrate. And of course he did. He went and took it, did it. He was playing a game on his computer or something. Okay. Any questions? That's just an illustration of it here. We have an incomplete sentence here. Circumcision, I think uncircumcision, I think they're not important. Now Allah is what kind of but?
It's introducing a new option.
A new option, it's not the same category, they're not in the same class, or they're not in the same set. I think I probably have that down here. Let me see here. Nothing, further. But there it is. Rung, R-U-N-G, Rung, I guess that's how it's pronounced. Although there are several contrastive and adversative particles, Allah adds the unique constraint of correcting some aspect of what precedes. In terms of distinction Allah from May, the key is in the relation is what follows the particle is what precedes. It's a relationship, see. In the case of May, the accepted element that replaced what precedes was a potential member of the negated set. That we have May in there, one of the earlier verses. And I had this on there. In the case of Allah, the correcting member is not a member of the original set, it's a new element. So it's something new in a different category, new set. Does that make sense now? So if we look at this, what he has here, circumcision, nothing, uncircumcision, but, okay, the keeping of the commandments of God. Now he leaves you hanging. He doesn't finish it. Okay? The keeping of the commandments of God, then you're left hanging. Is what?
Something.
It's something. All right? Now let me point out.
It's not nothing.
In the logic class, we're going to see what will negate something else or be the opposite of it, or contradiction or contrary. And what I think it's saying here, if these things are nothing, what's the opposite of nothing? What's everything? This is the very opposite of it. Keeping the commandments of God is what? Well, now you figured out how I interpreted it. I'm going to give you some other translations. New American Standard, circumcision nothing, uncircumcision nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. That's pretty good. But they have it in italics. What matters is. The New King James has it this way: circumcision nothing, and circumcision nothing, but the keeping the commandments of God is what matters. That's pretty good too. New Revised Standard, which I don't recommend, but it's kind of liberal. Circumcision nothing, uncircumcision nothing, but obeying the commandments of God is everything. I think it's got the best of the ones, but I don't recommend it overall as a translation. Does that make sense? So the other translators have interpreted this pretty much as I'm doing it too. I think it's what matters is keeping God's commandments. Whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised is not a commandment of God anymore. Say, but now he's saying what you really need to be worried about is you just take care of doing what God says. Here's some more translations. I've got a bunch of them here. The New International Version, which I certainly don't recommend, but I'm going to use it here. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. I think that's pretty good. The Revised Berkeley Version, circumcision has no value, neither has uncircumcision, but the observance of God's commandment does count. See, I think they've got the thrust of it right. International Standard Version, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing, but obeying God's commandments is everything. God's commands is everything. That's pretty good. God's Word translation, I've got a bunch of here. Circumcision is nothing, and lack of it is nothing, but keeping what God commands is everything. Again, I think that's pretty good. The Good News Bible. I'm going to quit. I'm just reading one right after another. There's a bunch of them that say what I've been saying. You'll have these notes. The word keeping is a nominative case noun. Now, a nominative case noun requires a verb to complete the sentence. See? And it's a finite verb that it needs to have to complete the sentence. But we need something that's the opposite of the word nothing. And so I think the opposite of nothing is either something or everything. And we'll learn that in the logic class in the next few weeks in our logic class that's on Monday nights. And James and Chris are in that class. And but we run that. So the opposite of the word nothing, I believe, is basically it's either everything or it's something, one of the two. Right? The Greek readers are left hanging in the air. It's elliptical. Now, why would he do that? Well, sometimes whenever you do that, it's a rhetorical device. It convinces the person. When you have to think it out yourself, you draw the conclusion, then that becomes part of your thinking process. The Bible doesn't never have complete logical arguments. It makes you complete them. And so you have to think it through, and it becomes part of your thinking process. That's what psychologists tell us, right? I've not cited the various translations because I endorse them, but to show how various translators have completed the ellipsis, okay? Yes. Here's how I translated it. The circumcision is nothing and the uncircumcision is nothing, but being a keeper of the commandments of God, right? It has everything, right? So it's nothing, but it becomes everything. Doing what God says. And the other translations had some pretty good ways to look at it too, and I can't fault them, most of them that I cited, how they rendered it. Because you got to fill in the ellipsis, and I'm using the word but in the contrast. It's in an opposite set. See? Well, good and evil would be opposite sets, for example. And and so forth. Any question? Anybody? Okay. Here is the square of opposition chart, which I'll get into in the logic class. You can see it here. And so these are nothing. So this would be this, no S or P, or some S or not P. It's got to be one of those two. And the contradiction or the opposite of that would be all S or P. So if it's some or not, some of these things are not important, then all, so it would be the all. That's why I kind of went with that. I think it was some and all. But we'll go into it right here any further. But I believe that will lay it out for you. I want those in the logic class, this is going to be a very important thing that we're going to use it over and over and over. Right? We won't go any further with it right here though. All right. Now then, I think we got time for one more verse. All right. We're supposed
maybe two.
Okay. Jerry, did you do the last one?
Mm-hmm.
Chris, could you do that for us?
Yes. Hekastos, ente, kalese, eklethe, in, tote, min, to. I have let every man abide in the same calling in which he was called.
Okay. Now again, if we go back to chapter 6, there were some that had been certain things, but they had been washed, they had been cleansed, and they quit it. So they quit doing some of those things. So he has to be saying, let him abide in what kind of calling? Lawful, unlawful? It has to be a lawful calling. And again, being circumcised and uncircumcised is a lawful calling. Being married or not married is a lawful calling. He's going to list some more callings as we get here. I don't think it justifies continuing in a sinful situation, as some try to make it. I think they've argued something here that's just not reasonable. One must not interpret this to allow continuing in a sinful calling, a homosexual marriage, continuing as a thief, continuing as a liar, continuing in adultery, and so forth. Repentance, Acts 70:30, requires cessation of sinful activities. Does that make sense? And I've heard people try to use this, okay, just continue in whatever state we're in.
I use the word state. Would that be more of an interpretation instead of using calling?
Well, I think there's some of the translations that go with it as state, okay? But calling is good. State is.
Oh, I put let each one remain in the state in which he was called. So I guess I used them both.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and the calling in which he was called. And I used the first one, I call it a state.
Okay.
Or condition. Or
I
situation.
agree in this calling. And so it's in this calling. All right.
So I could do calling.
It's actually
Calling.
hutos, and that's the near demonstrative, although American Standard translates it as that calling. But I think it's this calling. And he may still be talking about marriage state, but I think he's talking about Jew and Gentile in that context as an illustration. Continue whatever calling you have. Don't worry about what your racial situation is. You're not going to change it anyhow. All right? Any questions? Okay, James, let's try verse 21 and we'll quit. Let's do it if you can for us.
Okay. Doulos eklethes me soy meloto ala e kai dunasai eleutheros genestai malon kresai. And I translated that, were you called as a slave? don't worry about it. But even if you are able to become free, rather use it.
Okay? A Christian who was free would have more freedom to serve the Lord, wouldn't he? Whereas a slave would have to do what his master had him to do. And might be working a lot of extra hours, where a free man might have more time to serve the Lord by teaching and doing things for the kingdom. So how do you interpret that there? How did you translate it? You gave us your translation, but the bondservant, slave, is that how you translate it? I've forgotten.
I translated it where you called as a slave.
Slave. Think that's good. American Standard has bondservant, and a bondservant is a slave. Okay, someone has been bought by somebody else. I just can't even comprehend why you'd want to think you could own another person. This doesn't even, my mind just can't fathom it. Okay. If you are a bondservant, care not for it. Don't get yourself all in an uproar because you're a slave. A lot of the early Christians were slaves. So if they got in an uproar over it and began to be concerned, they might not be doing a good job in their service. I think he gives instructions to servants or slaves in other passages. Now, I don't think he's justifying necessarily owning slaves. I'm not saying that, but he does tell the slave how to continue on and do the best he can with his situation. I think the Lord will take care of him in that role. Okay. Stop being all in an uproar about it. Right. But if you can or you're able to become free, then let yourself become free. Do it. Go ahead and get your freedom if you can. Right? You know, I don't know what the early church did. There were lots of slaves. Is it possible that some rich members of the church bought Christians and freedom so that they could serve the Lord from other masters? It's possible. Might have. And I can see how that would be a fruitful thing. If you have a lot of money, you might be able to get several of the members of the church free and get them, make freemen out of them, and they can become servants of the Lord better. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what happened in the church. I can see rich members of the church maybe doing something like that, and helping people get free. But I don't know. We don't have any evidence that they did or didn't. The Bible just doesn't tell us. Any questions? My paraphrase of it, don't be over concerned in the fact that you're a slave, a bondservant, but if you can obtain your freedom, use it to serve the Lord as his bondservant. Okay? Now that's my paraphrase of it. Any question? Or you call being a bondservant or a slave and stop having concern with him for it. But if you have the power to become free, use it rather. And then I footnoted that. Use it more fully. See? Use that freedom more fully to serve the Lord. I think it's probably time for us to be through with class. Okay. Any questions? Okay. We'll start with verse 22 next week. Start the recording.
Thank you. We'll